We are going to work on a small sketch study of a smaller version of this painting that I did of snowflake flowers, and I wanted to get started by showing you some of the stuff that we need for this painting. So I have printed out two references. I have the photograph that I took of the snowflake flowers that I'm going to be using as a reference, and I also have a black and white study that I printed out where I can look for values, especially this is a higher contrast version where I can see the shadows on the edges of the big shape and the divisions between the petals very clearly. I have my pencil sketch already worked out, a board here that I'm going to tape it to that I can move around. I have my standard brushes that I use for my classes that I teach locally, and those brushes in 2025 are going to be the Princeton Velvet Touch. This is a 14, but a 12 is acceptable as well. This is my liner brush for detail work. It's a 10/0, and this is my Princeton Velvet Touch number 4 long round. For scrubbing and lifting, I like to use these Silver Whites by Silver Brush. I've got a 10 and a 4 bright. In our palette, although we're probably not going to use all these colors for this particular painting, I have Mineral Violet, Permanent Rose, Pyrrole Scarlet, Cadmium Free Yellow, Hansa Yellow Light, Nicolazzo Yellow, Yellow Ochre, Burnt Sienna, Cobalt Blue Hue, Phthalo Blue Red Shade, Windsor Blue, Phthalo Green, and Sap Green. I have a palette where I will mix, and this is a handmade one, brings joy to my day, and I have a big bowl of clean water. We will also need a paper towel. I like to rip them into smaller pieces and use small pieces at a time. And the last thing that we're going to need is going to be masking tape to stretch our paper onto our board. And this, I'll use this. And actually now's a good time to go ahead and wake up our paints before we get started. So the main colors that I'm going to use today are going to be Windsor Blue, maybe some Cobalt Blue. I'll use Burnt Sienna, Sap Green, Nicolazzo Yellow, Hansa Yellow Light, and maybe some Permanent Rose. So I'll put a little bit of water on all those to wake those up, and I'll get started and tape down my board. I want to make sure that I tape down all 4 sides so that as my paper is wet, it might buckle, but if I stretch it and tape it very sturdy to my board, it will dry flat. It's important to use good quality tape. I use the Scotch 2020. That won't bleed underneath and will hold it sufficiently. Also, I use the thick tape. The thick tape really grabs it and gets it stuck on there, so it will dry flat. So I'll get that taped down and I'll be right back. Okay, so you want to make sure that your tape really gets pressed down on here. Sometimes you'll find that some papers tear with masking tape. That has more to do with the paper and whether that paper holds tape well than really anything else, even your technique. But I will at the end show you how to pull the tape off of this. I really want to seal this down really well, and then I want to feel where my joint is. So this tape is on top of this tape, and I have a joint here that's exposed, and I'm going to double tape that seam closed so that water really can't seep into that corner. And I'm going to do that to all of my corners. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to do our background first. Before I start painting, I want to take a kneaded eraser and I want to get some of the residue of my graphite off of my drawing so that I don't have excess graphite in there. So I'm going to roll my kneaded eraser into like what I would call like a pottery tube from having a background and doing some pottery, but like a little noodle. And I'm going to use very light pressure and I'm going to roll it over my paper. What I want to try not to do with watercolor paper in general is overly erase on my paper. I don't want to I don't want to mess up the sizing on the paper because the water won't absorb into the paper and stick into it as well if I do that. So I don't want to get rid of my drawing. As you can see, I can still see my drawing, but I don't want any excess graphite, and I'm not going to be erasing it later. So the pencil that we have left here is the pencil that's going to stay to help us guide our drawing, but it also will become a part of our final artwork. So the first thing that we're going to do to start our painting is build up a nice big enough puddle of our background colors that we're going to use. What I want to use for my background today is a almost black, very dark, heavy, paint heavy mixture of Winsor blue, which is a phthalo blue red shade, and burnt sienna. Because we already let water just kind of settle into those paints, they're already awake, but they're already softened, and it's easy for us to pull paint out of there. And you can see when I mix burnt sienna into the blue, I get this really rich, pretty dark color. I'm going to bring it a little bit more towards the warm side of things by mixing in more burnt sienna. And I'm just going to leave it at this dark, very thick, rich, you can see how fast it's dripping, dark paint. And then I'm going to kind of write it on the edge of my palette here to get the excess to drip in there. And I'm going to make one more puddle, and that's going to be, well, I'm going to make 2 more puddles, but my next puddle is going to be of just straight burnt sienna. And we're going to drop that into some areas after we paint our background dark to bring some of those. I'm going to do a really like ephemeral, impressionistic, loose, almost abstract interpretation of this background. We're not going to do it so literal as something that's more time intensive, but we just want to kind of get that feeling of that very early spring where things are still brown and some things are starting to green, and what that space is like. So the last color we're bringing into that environment is going to be obviously our green. And for our green, I want it to drop more in the background. On our source drawing, you can see that our greens that are in the background are more blue, and our greens that are in the foreground are more yellow. In general, yellow things come forward and blue things recede, so we can use that to our advantage to create depth and space that way. So we're just going to take our sap green and we're going to drop a little bit of that Winsor blue into there to make that green a more blue-green kind of a color. And we have our colors ready for our background. So let's get started. I'm going to start here with this green. I'm just going to make a quick line straight down. And while it's still wet, I'm going to take my brown, my dark brown, like 2, and I'm going to ride that right into that edge and let it bleed together, and I'm going to come right along the other edge and let that bleed together. I'm following in this area, I'm following the line of my grass pieces, and that's intentional. And I'm going to drop in some burnt sienna just to give it some brown texture. And before it dries, I'm going to come up and get some more of my green, and I'm applying this all pretty paint dense. Now I want to be really aware of where my petal ends over here. I don't want to paint in my petal. I want to paint around that. So, okay. Now we have some greens coming through, and we can press on with our browns. So I'm going to start with my brown in this area first. You can see I've actually got a good deal of paint on my brush. The reason is because I want to go a far way with this paint, and so I want it to be pretty juicy, and I'm going to use gravity to bring it with me. And I might actually go soften that green edge so I can catch it in a minute, but I'm going to start with gravity up here and let it slide down as I come down. And decide what we want to do about that green edge over there. So I'm going to soften out this green edge really quick before it dries. I'm going to get my brush really clean, and I'm also going to dry it off with my paper towel. And I'm going to come here and I'm just going to soften this edge right here so that I have time to work in this area, and I can still get a soft edge even after this totally dries. So by doing that, what I'm setting myself up for is to let this completely dry before I come get that. But it buys me some time to get my edge wet over here and to be flexible about how I'm working over here. All right, so now we have that edge softened, and we can come make sure all these edges stay softened. All right. And I'm just going to paint in all of my background. And I'm going to make sure that my edges don't have a chance to dry and push my board around as I go. Now let's take a glance at our source image. I'm not going to paint the white flowers in the background and all like these complicated stems and stuff. There's a lot going on, and I really want to make this a simplified version of what's happening. So I'm just going to throw some kind of ephemeral, lighter burnt sienna speckles on there, and then I might even let them kind of like move a little bit, blend into that background some. Let them just go where they're going to go, and let's see where we are. What we really want to do here is create a dark setting that our snowflake flowers can pop out of, because they're going to be bright, bright white. And if we want to, we can bring a little bit more. We have some time now because this is a soft edge. So we can take a little bit more of our green, and we can consider just moving through some hints of more. You can see I just rode that right through the wet brown, and it'll stay put and push some of the other stuff out of the way, and just give us some hints of more greens back here, but still dark, still low contrast because they're kind of out of the way. We don't really want too much focus on that. Cool. And then as this all starts to dry, I'm going to work with these it's kind of bloomy textures, and it's kind of a wooded environment are working for me. So I'm going to appreciate those kind of moments, and maybe see if we can softly pull out a little reference to some of these grasses have some highlights around this top edge. I flipped my picture, as you can see, to go the same way as my painting that I'm working on. So I've got a damp, I've cleaned my brush with clean water, and I'm getting off probably 75% of the water. It's mostly dry but a little bit damp, and in one fell swoop I'm going to ride that highlight edge with just plain water. I'm going to ride on top of it twice, and I'm going to give it a minute and see what that does before I mess with it too much more. I'm going to do the same thing to this top one. I'm going to ride right on this inside. I've got kind of a light pressure, not a strong pressure. And depending on how wet your paper still is, will depend how much paint gets picked up right here. And I want this to be kind of subtle. I really want this to be in the background. If I wanted this to be less subtle and a more crisp, sharp line, I'd use one of those silver white brushes to do this. But I'm sticking with the Velvet Touch right now because I really want it to be soft, and I don't want it to be a focal point or just wanted to define that shape in a blurry kind of way. So less is more, like anything, right? So I might come in and just hit that highlight on that edge just a little bit to really exemplify that. So I've got my silver brush, white, and I'm just gonna pull off. I'm even got a broken line, like I'm not gonna go all the way across or anything. I just want to feel that highlight edge. And this is now probably soft enough for us to keep going and to be able to soften the rest of the way into that edge. What I'm going to do here is very quickly take a second to fill in before this color shift gets shifted too much from mixing up my paint and everything. There's a little edge, a little piece right here, and we're going to color that in. So I'll come right here. And I've got my Princeton Velvet Touch number 4 now. Okay, and so you can see I've got a little bit of residual, a puddle of paint there. And so it's best practice just to suck the water back out so that you don't have a moving puddle of paint in a place where you don't want there to be one. Okay, now we're going to go back to our size 14 brush, our big one, and we're going to keep going. So we'll start with this top corner, and I may actually even start with it with a darker green because that's something that I kind of see happening in my background picture. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to do this with a lighter green on top so it pops off hopefully. I'll blend in right into that wet. I'm going to go right into my dark brown mixture of burnt sienna and blue. Now that's starting to be very green, so I'm going to use my burnt sienna to kind of get some of that red in there instead, and we'll keep working around. You can see I'm just kind of switching our colors as we go. I want to be able to twist my board, so I got some stuff out of the way so that we can do that. When I get to the edge of my Snowflake Flower, I want to be mindful of that edge of that flower. This is how we're defining that shape of that flower. So, especially with a flower that is white, we're really using this dark background to really define that shape of that flower. So we really want to be mindful about that. We're going to have to soften this edge again to get it to blend black in here, but we'll come up next to it and we will get that done. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I've got a clean brush. It's mostly dry. I put a lot of, it's really mostly a dry brush. I put a lot of pressure on my paper towel when I got the water out so that it doesn't obstruct the stem underneath, and I just soften and blend that edge in. And then I think we might need a little bit more of our mix here. So I'll blend up a little bit more of our mix, get ourselves headed this way. And it's okay if it's not the same color because I want it to be kind of a multicolored background that kind of abstractly represents that changing red, brown, dirty kind of underground, forest undergrowth area. And I've got the same thing happening here, so we're going to need to soften that edge before we go too far as well. So I'll come up here. I'm going to make my brush pretty dry. I'm really going to squeeze out most of the water. You can see I really squeezed it out there. That is enough to soften my edge, and then not having too much water is what's going to preserve the integrity of my stem underneath. Okay, let's go into our red, just for fun. And I also want to think about referencing that red over there. I want to bring them together. And let things head head this way. And all these little blooms and stuff that's happening back here, in this case, I think is going to be really pretty because it represents that really textural background back there. And so those are going to be really textural in this. Okay, there we go. We've got a little bit of green up in the top corner. We can decide if we want any other green kind of coming through here. We're not going to do those actual flowers coming through there, but we can put a couple more just like loose references to them so we can see the, by them I mean the grasses. Pretty. And we'll keep it like that, like really just loose and textural and just an abstract feeling of that ground, that very early spring and the greens just starting to pop out on top and the earth just starting to come alive. And in a second we'll move on and we'll paint the next part. So we are going to wait for this to dry in full. If you want to, you can use a hairdryer and dry it off. While I wait for it to dry, I'm going to take my water bowl to get fresh, clean water because we're going to start with our bright yellow next. And I don't want that to muddy my bright yellow in any way. I want to be able to have some pops that are really saturated bright yellow. So I'll be right back with some clean water. Okay, so we've got some clean water, and the next thing that we're going to do is move into our Hansa yellow light to get some cool yellow, some brilliant cool yellow into those stems. So I'm going to make a pretty paint dense mixture here. I'm going to paint wet into wet for these stems, and what I want to do is I want to make a mixture here that is my cool yellow. And I also want some sap green that I can lay into it that is maybe a little more straight sap green than that. So I'm going to also pull out some sap green in a little puddle over here that's got the less blue, a little bit greener qualities of sap green. And those two colors together are going to start to make our stems. And so, cool. Let's do it. So, the first thing I'm going to do is get a fresh paper towel. Okay, I like to have a paper towel on hand so that I can manage and control my water. And we're going to take this bright yellow. Make sure it is wet enough to move and be really fluid. I want to be able to drop green into it, so it needs to stay wet for a second. And I'm going to start with this top section of this leaf. I'm going to, just like I would a flower petal, I'm going to treat the top and the bottom section of the leaf, and maybe even this middle section, as entirely different areas to paint. So I'm going to paint them one at a time. And this flower I want to be sharp. I want it to be in the foreground. Okay, so I've got some yellow on there, and I'm going to go in here now. I've got a very small bit of paint. Now I'm going to move into this small bit of paint, and I'm going to start to drop just some lines here with this small bit of paint. And this is actually my bluer green. This is reading a little bit more on the bluer side to me. And I'm just going to put some suggestions of some lines that follow the path of that yellow leaf. And I'm going to keep going until my value and my overall color feels similar to that top leaf. And I don't want to touch it while it's drying. You know what I even want to do? I want to come in with a little bit of neutral brown here in the center and neutralize it out a little bit. Pretty. So I want to just let it dry intact. So I'm going to move on to my next stem, and I'm going to look into one that's not touching that, so I can do my next stem. And so I think I'll actually move into this yellow bud, flower bud of these guys, which is so fascinating to me. This is the bud of this snowflake flower is this bright, brilliant yellow color, and the actual flower itself is this white color, but it does have these yellow things on it. So so there's two different kind of things happening here. One is a more gray shadow, and one is a green splooch. So let's do our green splooch first. We'll start in at the base, and then we'll just let our brush quickly splooch that out. And then what we need next is a gray for a shadow, and we're going to need some gray in a bit anyway, so let's go ahead and start making our gray. Our gray is going to be a mixture of Winsor blue, maybe even a smidge of our cobalt blue, and burnt sienna. I'm going to make a strong gray here, and then we'll do a lighter gray next to it. Good, and we'll do a little bit more cobalt blue in there to cool it down. Give ourselves a nice cool gray neutral. I'm going to keep adding my two colors back and forth together until I'm happy with my neutralized color that I've come up with. Okay. Now I'm going to come into the area next to it and have a lighter gray that I can use. And I'm going to come, let's see, this shadow rides right under the edge. And I'm just looking at my source photo to kind of suggest where some of these flowers are, some of these shadows are. And so I've got one that rides the edge of that, and then this is dark up above this guy. That's a second guy. And then this is going to be the bottom side of that leaf. So I want to make sure that edge is crisp. And then in here, I've got another shadow. Cool. And let's see, we'll get a little bit more of our lighter version of our gray. And we can come in under this detail here and come up this way. And we left this little thing white, and we'll come back in there and lift out that edge too to bring that white. And now we're going to bring this yellow into this whole other bud under here. And then that whole thing is in that shadow value. So I'm just going to drop that shadow color in while it's wet and make that whole thing be our shadow color, the yellow version of our shadow color. Cool. A lot of times in painting, the value is really the most important thing to appropriately render a shape. So we want to do one more thing. We want to bring from this white area here. Well, it's still a little bit damp, but veering towards dry. And I'm going to use my silver white number 4 bright to carve out that highlight edge. And there's a little bit of that over here happening. So I'll carve that out over here as well. Again, this is a sketch version, so we're not going to put the time into it to really make it completely realistic. For me, I'm a slow painter, and getting something to be completely realistic, it's something that takes a while. It's not something that just happens quickly, and I want this to be a fun and quick sketch for us to do. But we can put some details of where some of our light patterns go. Pretty. Okay. So this, in the time that we have painted these area, Now this has dried, so we can come back and do this stem. We don't really want to do this right here because this is still wet and it'll touch that. And when they touch, they'll bleed together. But what we do want to do is this area. So I'm going to notice that in my photo, this is a little bit of a bluer area. The highlight is bluish. The highlight here is bright yellow. And then under here, it's a bluish kind of a shadow. So I'm going to start with my yellow just in this stem area, not in that actual highlight on the bud area of it. And I'm going to make this my wet base that I'm going to go wet into. I'm going to get my greener version of these two greens over here. I think that I still want this to be bluer, so I want the yellower version. I'm going to make sure that I hit my yellow into my green there so that they softly and organically make that beautiful merge blend together. And I'm going to hit this bottom corner with some more yellow too. I'm going to leave a highlight edge over there, and I can carve it out the rest of the way in a second. I'm going to get some more yellow. I'm going to hit this bottom edge with some yellow, and I'm going to bring some of that yellow up into this. Pretty. Okay, and now I'm going to go into the dense version of my sap green, pretty much just straight sap green over here. And I want to do this without a lot of little strokes. I want to follow the bottom of it up until the point of the shadow area underneath this leaf over here. All right, and we've got that bright yellow highlight area. Underneath there is going to be more of a shadow, so I'm actually going to use this gray shadow kind of color that I've built. And I'm going to go while it's still wet and really fill in this abyss underneath this leaf with that dark gray, and also maybe ride some of the very bottom of that stem with that dark gray as well. And I may even take my gray and go down the back of this section here and bring some volume onto my back side of this like that. And then we will soften that out, that highlight out in a second with our number 4. But that gets us pretty close. If we do it, you know, there's plus or minuses to anything. If we do it while it's still damp, we'll lift more off more easily. And we'll end up being able to get more off. Whereas if we wait until it's, actually I want to push this edge back too, so I'm going to do it with my tool that I use for. But if we get water, if we drop, we want to do this with a pretty dry brush. If we get water dropped into our wet paint, it'll bloom. And in this area, this is not somewhere that we really want there to be a blooming texture. So again, I'm not looking to replicate all of the textures right here. This is a sketch version, and I really just want to suggest some of those value changes in areas where some of that shift happens. In the cool, and I'm not actually going to put blue in there. I'm just going to let it be a change from white to yellow. And that bright yellow up top here is going to represent all that warm yellow in the leaf. But I do want to pull some of my color saturation out on this edge, because this edge in my photograph is less yellow. And I want to make sure that my yellow is in the highlighted area where it needs to go. Okay. All right, so let's do another one. That should have given this area enough time to dry, which would give us the ability to do this one or this one. So let's do the back one first. I'm going to do the same thing. My paint's starting to dry, so I'm going to pull a little bit more water into my Hansa Yellow Light. I am going to paint straight Hansa Yellow into, and I got a pretty watery mix here because I want to be able to paint wet into wet, and I need it to have a wet enough base to do that. So here, my gradient doesn't move in the exact, actually, I'm going to let it dry for a minute here, and I'm going to put a little bit more water on this too. Alrighty. And we'll drop some yellow in here. I'm going to still bring the green up through the yellow, but it's a little bit too wet right now to hold that easily. So and I'll drop some more lime green into this, or some more yellow, which the two together will make a lime green. And now I'm watching this as it dries, making sure it's drying evenly and checking how much water is left in there, and now it's a lot less. So now I can go into this sap green, and I want a pretty dry mix of the paint because otherwise it's going to bloom. And I want to go really along this bottom edge. And then as we get towards the end here, I cleaned my brush off to get less paint on my brush, so I don't apply any more paint than I really want to. And I've got my green on my bottom edge, and I've got my yellow on my top edge, and I've got my highlight in that corner, which we will soften, but we'll wait for it to dry a little bit. And we have two left. We have a little edge in here that we're actually going to do next, which is a pretty bluish kind of a color. So we're going to go into our blue-green over here. And it's also a highlight edge. So I'm going to really lean into the blue to dramatize that being a blue kind of area, a blue edge. Now that's a melodramatic interpretation of that color, but it's for this for the sake of the prettiness of the picture, to make that blue be pretty. And that's kind of the one area where we're going to have some blue pop up. And you can see how pretty this is. We made our own kind of a teal kind of blend here. And I'm going to drop some more saturation into this bottom edge so it really... and then down here is going to be green plus our shadow area underneath. Alright, this is drying enough for us to be able to carve back out our whole highlight edge of this guy. So I want to soften that and bring that edge down, and maybe a little bit more in here and maybe in here. Give it a little bit of texture, and along this front edge here, I really want that to be very highlighty. So pick up that light really clear. And I'm seeing something else I want to carve out while I'm here, and while I need to let everything else dry anyway. And it's this front of this leaf here. I want that to really separate from, I want to pull that off of that stem a lot. So I'm going to really pull a lot of pigment back. I might even use my towel to pick up some of it. And we'll notice in our picture that at the very front tip of this, it's pretty white. And it moves into yellow. So now we have a white tip, and that comes off of the stem and helps build that depth and that shape of that leaf a little bit. It might come in there, especially while it's damp, maybe with a little bit of that same teal color, and ride that inside edge. Smooth that back out in that whole thing, just to make it feel like that shape doing the thing that we want it to feel like. Okay, let's move into this one next. And again, we're going to repeat that same process. I need some more water in my handset because it's starting to dry, and water will waken that paint back up. Alrighty. So we're going in here. We are painting this stem with our cool yellow. And then I'm going to go in here with my straight sap green. I'm going to leave that whole edge white. I'm going to touch my yellow so it blends into it. I'm making these little cute little rounded areas on the bottom. Alright. Now I'm going to need some more of my rich gray while it's still wet to start to build some highlights here. I mean, some lowlights, some shadows. And I want them to be really rich gray, dark shadows in here, much like over there. And now we'll get some not watery but pretty painty, paint dense, not watery, sap green. And we will come along the edge here. And that's the reason why it's good to have done this front one last and the behind one first, so that one really drops behind. I also am seeing that there's a lot of shadow back in here, so I'm first going to start by putting our blue-green back in there, and then I'm going to put our shadow color right on top. Okay, so now we're just going to drop our shadow color right on top, and all those colors are going to mix together to be a summary of what we're looking for in this. Okay. Now another thing we may want to consider on this corner is we did lose a little bit of that bright yellow edge. So what I'm going to do is take my yellow and drop that right back on top to prioritize that yellow in that space, and we'll come lift some highlight back out of it, but we want to let it dry for a second to be able to do that. Now this is not touching that, so we can do our shadow edge here. We're going to do kind of the same kind of thing. Let's start with our teal turquoisey color that we made. Pretty. I'm going to reach into that sharp corner edge just with the tip of my number 4 long round. Alrighty, pretty. Now I'm going to go into my sap green, and there's an especially grainy edge right underneath. At the very bottom, we're going to have some yellow. And there's our textures. Let's let those hang out with our shadow color, and let's deepen it all. Well, we're going to do this while it's still wet, so that it's all blurry and soft utilization of these shadows. This edge matters, the one that rides the top of the petal. So even if you have to expand it, make sure that's a pretty edge. And then the last thing we want to do is there's a little reflected shadow from this petal onto there. Those kind of details are going to really help. So let's make some more shadow kind of color. Somebody went bonkers with their cobalt blue. Okay, so now we've got our gray. We're going to go back into here to get our lighter version of our gray. Well, maybe I need a little bit of the darker anyway. And I'm going to start in this area where I had this other shadow. I'm actually going to paint it so it's darker. And then I'm going to let it bleed out into that shadow area. Fun, huh? Same here. Go into here where it's very dark and let that bleed into there. Some of those are a little bit dramatized, right? That is okay, because dramatizing some of those things really drags home what's happening over there. And speaking of dramatizing, we're going to also drop in some more. If I need a really sharp edge on my brush, I'm going to roll it into my tip so that I have a really sharp edge on my brush. And most of the time, this is how I do my detail work. I don't even go for that liner brush, but sometimes I do. And let's put another dark shadow under the bottom side of that as well. And that'll make these guys stand out more. Pretty. Okay, so now we're just going to do a little bit of carving on our our bud part of our stem, and this is also softening this edge, which I'm looking for. All right, pretty. And this actually has a little bit of a highlight edge on the back side. So we're not going to overdo it, we're going to underdo it, but we are going to do it. And it has a little area that comes up here, some depth in there. Alrighty. Okay, and then really drive home this highlight edge on the top of our petal, on the top of our stem. Cool. Pretty. Yeah? Alright, let's do our last part. We're going to do our petals. So the first thing I want to do is clean up any edges that I need to clean up. If you have some spaces where your background bled onto your petal, but you really want to have a crisp petal, this number 4 silver white and a clean part of your paper towel will get those cleaned up. The way that I do that is I have a mostly damp brush and I come in at an angle and I slowly scrub it out. And this brush is soft enough that I'm not hurting my paper. My paper is not getting scratched. My emulsion's not getting picked up. It's very soft. It's a very light touch. Okay, so the last part of this project is going to be those pretty petals. And there's 2 different objectives we have with our petals and our flowers. Objective 1 is to show the 3-dimensionality of the entire flower head. Like the shadows are down here, over here, and on this side, and then this is all highlight. Highlight and shadows. Highlight, highlight, shadow, shadow, shadow. We're going to underdo this rather than overdo it. And then the second goal is to separate those petals from the leaves. So we're going to make sure that everywhere, you know what actually I'm going to do is my water is a little bit green tinted. I'm going to go get clean water. So here's how green my water is. I'll be right back. All right. This is a fun part of this, getting these flowers petals into place. So we're going to use this gray that we made, and we're going to use a pretty watered down version of it. So I'm adding water. I've got my light area gray over here. I'm going to twist this to make sure that this is really in view here. I have my dark gray and my watered down gray. The way that we get light value in watercolor is water. The more water, the more white of the paper seeps through. We really want these to be bright and glowy so that they really jump off of our dark background that we've set up. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is look at my gray, and I've got this light gray, and I am using the side of my brush to suggest these values in here, and just very quickly suggest a first round of values in there with this very watery, very light gray. Let me bring that in closer in case you can't actually see what happened. Okay, so it's we've got a very subtle gray happening here. We want that to be very subtle for our first pass. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm looking at my black and white, and I'm starting at the bottom. I'm pushing down with my brush and bringing my strokes up. I'm not copying exactly where those are, and I'm more focused on the whole shape of the whole petal than I am on a little area. And since I know where some of my darker values are going to come into play, I can start to drop wet into wet, a little bit of some darker values in there, but I really need to be really mindful about the softness of it, because it's really quick and easy to get carried away with that, and we really want it to be a white flower, right? Alrighty, and the last one is going to be just these bottom sections first, a little bit under here and there. This is going to be under here. And I'm going right over where those yellow things happen, right? That's an important note about what's happening. I am I'm pre-shading those yellow and green pretty edges in advance before I start to add my yellow and green. I want to shade them first. So let's make this shadow color a little bit richer by leaving the same amount of water we have up here and just dropping a little bit more paint into it. We still want this to be very pigmenty. And now we're going to do a second pass on the areas that are just a little bit more, we're still not really quite separating these petals from each other. We will get to that, but for now, I'm looking at where my highlight edges are and dropping some shadows just loosely and quickly into the general overall shape of the whole. This really up here needs it, of the whole thing. I've got a very light touch. Using the right brush helps. And this blends in these two together. This is the darkest edge here. And the last one. So we're going to go under here. We've got some under here. We've got some up here. And we can see these petals are starting to get defined just on their own. But this whole back edge here and this whole edge here. Okay, and the last step we're going to do is define those petals and really put some separation and some space in between those petals. I want a stronger value. I want stronger gray, so I'm going back into my pigment. I'm adding a little bit more in, and as we get along, these are drying. So this one is mostly dry, and I can really look at where some of these darkmost areas are. And so I am dropping a shadow pretty much behind this petal here to make this one look like it's in the back. And I'm going to do the same thing on this edge. I'm going to drop a shadow behind this petal to make it look like it's in the back, and then I'm going to softly work that out and soften that in. It's important that this edge remain white and that this edge remain white so that you can really see those petals. And then for the next one, we're going to come under here. There's a dark edge here. And we'll come under here. And got a pretty dark shadowy edge under here. And we'll let that be otherwise. Same here. We really want to come back and add one more spot of value to that area. This is the flower with the most of it in shadow. So a little bit of voluming. All right, and a little bit of dimension to this back petal back here. Cool, huh? And we've got some shape in our petals. Okay, let's do our very last, well, we need to let this totally dry first before we do our very last step. But our very last step is going to be beautiful and a lot of fun. And it's going to be those yellow speckles. I'll see you in a second. Okay, my friends, it's time for the last part of our flowers. Let's get a little bit more of our Hansa yellow light. Let's make a nice juicy pile. We're going to work wet onto wet with the yellow being our base. And what we're going to do is we're going to maybe overpaint the area a little bit where we want our green and yellow dots to be. And I'm going to go ahead and do them all because might as well. All right, so that's a pretty wet little puddle, and I've got a very saturated sap green over here. And I'm just going right into my sap green. And give it a second for it to dry so it doesn't smear too much. In fact, while I wait for it to dry, because I really do want it to dry, let's get a bunch of our greens working up here. While I wait for that to dry, let's go ahead and do the rest of these yellows because I want it to be a little bit drier than that, and these yellows don't take me that long to drop in. It's okay if these yellows are a little bit green. We're going to put, sorry, I'm focusing. We're going to put the whole green right in the whole thing, and it's going to spread right in there. So that's our objective anyway. These are still wetter and these are drier actually over here. So I'm going to go by how dry they are rather than which ones I did first. So I've got my sap green and I've got my yellow puddle, and I'm just putting some dots, maybe 2 or 3, in the very bottom of that puddle and letting it naturally get carried away and naturally kind of go up. And these have more water, so I can put less and they'll ride up on their own and they'll make that really pretty pattern. Let me bring it up so you can see that pretty pattern. And then we're just going to let this dry and we're done, and I'll peel the paint off so you can see. Let me bring it up so you can see those pretty patterns. Pretty, huh? All right, let's just give it a second to dry, and actually, you know what, we can peel the paint off. We can peel the tape off now. I'm going to start with my double corners. This is what we used to protect our corners so that we don't have to worry about any bleeding through the corners. This is going to give us a really crisp and clean edge on our pictures. Okay, now we can do this as long as we don't put our hand on that, so don't do that. But you can see, so this is the technique to peel off tape. Peel it down and away from your paper at an angle. And you probably want to peel that off first. So let's go back and we'll, rather than fight it, we're just going to go back and go in the right order. So I just keep it down when I peel. And then I can come back and get this. But again, what rips up paper, and if you get paper that has lots of edges that are all ripped up, it's the paper that does that, not much less likely to be your tape at fault. You do want to make sure that you wait for your base of your whole painting to be dry before you do this, because the whole point of taping it down is so that it dries flat, and it needs the tape to dry while it's wet. So, you know, my whole painting is dry here with the exception of those green yellow dots in the middle. So here is our painting off of our board. Give it a quick sign. All right. All right, and we're done. Bring it up. Have a good one, y'all. Happy New Year.